Hi everyone, today we're talking about The Knitting Way, a guide to spiritual self-discovery by Linda Sklonik and Janice McDaniel. Today I'm joined by Linda Jennings from Color Storms Yarn, and Linda's going to share our knitting tip today.
Thank you, Valerie. I just want to, this is our very last book club episode, and so I just want to say the obvious, which is to recommend to everyone to keep growing as a knitter. Read a new book, listen to a new podcast, join your local guild or a new group if you don't already have one. Try a new stitch. Just keep growing. Don't get stuck in a rut. Just keep growing. And thank you for all the times you've joined us over the past year.
I love that. I have two things to say. One, we're concluding the knitting way, but we are practicing what we preach and planning to do a new book for 2022. So we'll announce that shortly in a little while. And a practical tip for learning a new skill that I've noticed with some of my knitting students is, for me, I like to leapfrog off of my comfort level. Mm-hmm. And so the easiest way to do that for me is to use a smooth texture, light colored, medium weight yarn with a nice, I'm using a number 4 medium worsted weight yarn and a US 7 4.5 millimeter needle to learn something new. Mm-hmm. Even if the pattern is written with a different weight of yarn, that's my go-to because it's what I'm comfortable with. When I'm using a light color, I can see the stitches. It's a nice needle size for my hands, and it promotes learning the new skill without the complication of color in your yarn, splitty, like all the things that create barriers for learning or complications. Mm-hmm. Using a nice generic, very plain and boring yarn to learn on just sets me up for success.
Right. So your brain can focus on the new skill and not worry about the textures and the needle size and all that other stuff. Yeah. So it's kind of that Montessori method of learning is to start where you're at. What mm-hmm. do you know? And just add a little bit.
I didn't know that was a Montessori methodology, but that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's been the basis of how I taught in homeschool, and it's the way I've found that I learned too. You start where you start with what you know, add a little bit, and don't add any more until that little bit's really comfortable. And then you're ready to add another little bit. I don't know. You can jump in and learn 5 things at once too, if you feel in the mood for it. But if you're having struggles, it could be you have to back off a little bit and just dissect it a bit and just learn a little bit at a time.
I think that's true. And, this is coming from some of the knitting crochet trends where boucle fuzzy yarn is back on the scene and everybody wants that really cozy looking blanket. But part of the problem or barrier with those yarns is that it's so hard to see what you're doing. And some of my students want that finished project, but they don't have the comfort with the skills.
Okay.
So practicing the skills on a different yarn that you can see your stitches to build that confidence like you're talking about. Getting comfortable with the pattern, the stitches, like what it looks like on a smooth yarn, then when you transition to your project yarn, it's much easier.
Really good advice.
The boucle also covers a lot of mistakes. So
right, if you split the yarn, it doesn't show too much.
No big deal.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just took a spinning class with Judith McKenzie, and that was all about the textured yarns, making textured yarns in spinning rather than smooth yarns. And I have a feeling that get, as she was talking about making blankets out of textured yarns, it's interesting that you were saying that the boucle is all coming back and stuff. And so now would be the time to go ahead and work on that. I mean, sometimes it's nice to be with the trends. It's not always important, but it's part of what I've learned by reading this book. So I was going to talk about like some of the things I've learned from this book, and a big piece of it for me is having a bigger sense of my knitting community. I've tended to be kind of a hard-headed loner, and I usually get stuck into ruts. I don't want to know what everybody else is doing. You know, I kind of like my own little world. Thank you very much. I'll just keep knitting the same thing forever and ever. And really, when I was raising my children, you know, that kind of makes sense. All my brain power is with the wonderful stresses, the wonderful challenges of raising a family, and I was homeschooling. So you know, in that sense, it made sense to just kind of, my hobby would just be static, and I just stuck with what I knew because it was easy to just go there and be happy.
Yeah, it was fulfilling a different place in your life at that moment, right? Or it was fulfilling its purpose.
Right. But when the kids finally grew up and moved away, my oldest daughter really challenged me to get out there, join a guild, learn some new stitches. And really, that kind of began my growth as a knitter. And certainly this book helped so much. What did I write? I wrote down, I've enjoyed and needed a yarn knitting community, especially after my children grew up and moved away. I've learned to be more relaxed, to take more chances, and to appreciate what my knitting story was. And I enjoyed learning about your knitting story. So becoming more aware of that knitting community has been really good for me, you know, because I'm more on my own now and I don't have the stressors of raising a family.
Yeah, I'm always surprised by the connections that get made. You know, strangers coming together, friends coming together, like everyone has a knitting story. And even if you personally have never knit or crocheted, you have a story. I have found that every single person has a story. And for me, it's part of our collective textile understanding. I mean, even the t-shirts that we wear are made with the knit stitch. And if you wear socks, you are every day wearing the technology that has been developed from ancient times. And that to me is fascinating.
You know, Judith McKenzie was saying one thing that she's sort of become very strong feelings around the idea of things that you make by hand are so much better in quality than that you buy. And you know, shortcuts are made when you have to mass produce things, so that makes sense. But there's nothing like putting on a pair of handmade socks.
It's so good.
Yeah, and once I learned how better to repair the heels, I felt better about them, because it's frustrating when they wear out after a couple of years. Now I know what to do, you know.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, and I'm just thinking about like all the different ways, like, you know, you can make a sock 500 different ways times 100 exponentially. Like you can make custom socks that fit your foot. There's all of these math formulas that you can use to develop the sock that you love. And I bow down to the sock knitters. I don't have I have appreciation, but not experience.
Okay.
And the sock knitters have a great big universe. Like, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it was like the last thing I learned to do. I really wanted nothing to do with socks for a long, long time. I only wanted to knit sweaters,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm appreciating them more in the past 5 years. They are kind of a finicky little thing. Just give me something where I can knit and knit and knit and knit and not think. But
Yeah.
socks they're a fun little challenge and not such a long project as a sweater. So I appreciate that about them.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, the number of stitches in a pair of socks versus the number of stitches in a sweater. That would be an interesting comparison. Okay. I don't know what the difference is.
Well, certainly you can go by yardage.
True. Oh, yeah. So, like, if a sweater is 1,000 yards and a pair of socks is 400, then, you know.
Yeah, really more like 300.
I know, because a skein of fingering weight yarn, there's always that little bit left. Not quite enough to do something with, but more than you want to throw away.
Yeah. Yes. And I did want to knit a sweater out of fingering. I have a few times knit a sweater out of fingering yarn, and it did take about 2,000 yards compared to 300. But it was a lot of fun. I knit it so fast because I had so much fun with it.
Oh, that's cool. There's some fingering weight leftover sweater patterns bubbling up in the universe, in the knitverse, and they're really interesting. There's a couple patterns even that have scrap fingering yarn knitting and scrap fingering yarn crochet, and they look amazing. They're like companions because the sweaters are the same shape but different crafts.
What a great idea. I mean, now that I finally have knit enough socks that I have like a whole bag of leftovers, that's something I could consider now. I know. I used to not have any fingering leftovers because I only knit with worsted.
It's so good. It's like a trip down memory lane, because I'm sure as you make the fingering weight scrap project, and I say scrap with love, I don't mean like,
oh yeah, yeah. It's beautiful stuff usually.
Of course, but I think it would be like traveling down memory lane when I remember this project and add the new one in that project.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. So thank you, Knitting Wave, for all the ways you stretched me with the projects. I learned the Mobius knitting project. That was so interesting. And I learned so much from you with your knitting tips. So it's been a fun year.
So good. I can't wait to see what we're going to do for the next year, but I've had so much fun talking about knitting.
We're going to talk all about it next week, right? We're going to introduce our new book.
I hate keeping a surprise, but I love a surprise. I want to shout it to the world in due time.
Okay. Well, Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a wonderful week.